Well, first of all, just as kind of background to remind us, a very prolific filmmaker, and his films are usually divided into these three categories of musicals, melodramas, and comedies, with these films underneath are perhaps a bit hard to fit in. Under the Clock, it's a wonderful romance film, sort of funny, but not really a comedy. Undercurrent is a film noir, stands out really. Okay, you might say film noir is a kind of melodrama, but it's clearly much more driven by noirish concerns. And The Story of Three Loves, which is an absolutely lovely film, it's got a fantasy, and again doesn't quite fit in exactly to any of the other categories. But otherwise, I think we can fairly simply say, yes, musicals, melodramas, comedies. But of course, once you start to think about it, you realize that these are not that clear distinctions. Most musicals are also comedies, and of course, a term for musical is indeed musical comedy. And many of these films, and particularly The Pirate and Bells Are Ringing, really, the numbers in those are wonderful, but you could take the numbers out and they'd still be very funny films. They really are kind of terrific comedies, even without the set pieces, as it were. And similarly, of course, musicals and melodramas are but almost such close in terminology, because they both mean films defined by the way they use music. Musicals because they have musical numbers, melodramas because it means drama with music. So inevitably, the two forms have a great deal in common, a great affinity, that sense of upping the emotion, upping the intensity through the use of music, whether it's in a number or whether it's in a melodramatic climax. So not surprisingly, there are lots of affinities across that body of work. Brigadoon, as those of you who've not seen it, I was going to say those of you who've not seen it, as those of you who've not seen it know, rather those of you who've not seen it, I should tell, is a film about a village in Scotland which has a curse upon it and can only appear out of the mist once every 100 years. And on that one day, a pair of American men stumble in. One of them falls in love with Sid Charisse, Fiona, her name is. Gene Kelly falls in love with Sid Charisse, and that's what the film's about. But the problem is, of course, that the village is going to disappear. But there's going to be a curse on the village if anyone leaves the village. So everyone who's born in the village has to stay in the village forever. And this is the sequence in which one of the young men, fed up with this condition, decides he's going to escape from the village, and then he is chased. In the original Broadway show, the chase sequence was a big choreographic number, choreographed by Agnes de Mille. But when it came to making the film, Gene Kelly took over the choreography, and this number, this sequence, is not really a fully danced sequence. But there's a very interesting piece of casting, I think, and that's the casting of the young man who decides to run away from the village, played by Hugh Lang. Now, Hugh Lang was actually an extremely important ballerino, a male dancer in the ballet. And this is a portrait of him taken by Angus MacBean, of course, very famous theatrical photographer of the time. And these are two ballets featuring Hugh Lang, choreographed by Anthony Tudor, who was also Hugh Lang's lover. So that Lang was a really very well-known dancer, particularly well-known for extremely dramatic roles. Just to say, Minnelli was, his first job was as a window dresser. He worked at Marshall Field's store in Chicago. These are from, actually, the photo is from before he worked there, and the menu card is from after. But they're just perhaps to give an idea that it was a really major department store, but also always very concerned to be up with the latest fashions. So that was the kind of milieu which formed Minnelli initially. And now it's hard to illustrate that directly. It's hard to find any window dressing, photos of his window dressing, or of his set designs when he moved to Broadway and was a set designer. I think one has, though, some sense of his feeling for design in all the films, but rather explicitly in the lovely comedy Designing Woman, in which the sets themselves are clearly very much concerned to be, the last word. They're absolutely the latest thing, but seen in a very chic way. So we have a couple of images here which clearly very much are beautifully handling that particular kind of 50s fashionable decor style, home decor style of the period. But Minnelli was also, of course, a costume designer, and again, for Broadway. But again, I can't find any examples to show you. He did, however, design the costumes for the film Lovely to Look At. There's some disagreement, really, about was it just him or whatever. But maybe these two stills from Lovely to Look At give some idea of his kind of very Baroque style of costume, often very elaborated, things upon things, like a sort of modernist Baroque might be a way of describing what he did. And again, we get some sense of his interest in fashion in the fashion show In Designing Woman. So again, if you want to get some sense of him as a costume designer and a set designer, in a way Designing Woman, which is about, of course, a woman who designs, is as well as obviously designing in a romantic comedy sense, then that's a very good place to go. Okay, I just want to say a couple of other brief things about the question of design and design mattering, just to link up two aspects of Minnelli's work that I'm not going to go into now. One is his connection with African-American culture. Very much, of course, on the margins of it, but still very involved with it, very much in the backwash, particularly when working in New York, of the Harlem Renaissance, of Cafe Society, of the Cotton Club, and so on. He actually designed the costumes and sets for Josephine Baker's triumphant return to the Ziegfeld Follies after her years in France. So he worked with other major black stars. And of course, the major black star of all he worked with was Lena Horne, who of course is in the film that follows this, Cabin in the Sky. And he worked with her a lot in Hollywood, and he was already a friend of hers and worked with her before she went to Hollywood. And he directed some of the numbers many of the numbers in films mainly directed by other people. This is from her first film, Panama Hattie. This dress is what a friend of mine, I was watching this, which actually in colour, but I didn't have a colour slide, saw me watching this and said, oh my goodness, that dress just hasn't been left in peace. I've always thought that was a great thing. Everything's added, it's more and more complicated and so on. But anyway, there's a kind of exuberance there all the same. So it's a big debate, really, I'm not going to get into, about really quite, is this kind of a terrible stereotype mockery in some African-American culture, or is it drawing upon the acknowledged hybridity of African-American culture? And it's a very complicated issue, but I think it's, again, an issue of design. He directed this really wonderful sequence from Words and Music to the number Where or When, and this time I'm just showing this one image from it. And of course, he made Cabin in the Sky, which was, of course, his first film. So he had that connection with African-American culture, one that's actually very uneasy now when we look at it, although I don't think it was felt uneasy at the time, neither by Josephine Baker and Lena Horne, nor by Vincente Minnelli. What's interesting, I think, about Minnelli in general is that there is often a sense of another world. It may sometimes actually be a dream world. I mean, it is in Yolanda and the Thief, it is in The Pirate, it is in, sorry, to remind myself, it is also in An American in Paris and in Cabin in the Sky. So all of them actually have dreams. But there's also the idea of reincarnation. We just saw it on A Clear Day. It's also in Goodbye Charlie, for instance. An idea of theatricality, which is very strong in lots of the films, obviously in something like The Bandwagon, but also subtly in Meet Me in St. Louis. Think of that setting up the lights for a scene, for instance. And when it's not that, there's often a kind of intense magic, an intensity and an almost kind of magic quality to events that take them into a different realm. The Halloween sequence in Meet Me in St. Louis, the whole idea of Brigadoon. Kismet, too, is a kind of Arabian Nights fantasy. Madame Bovary is all about wanting to live in this more intense dream world, and Story of Three Loves very much places on that, which is also partly a kind of dream film anyway. So those are just to pick out some of them. So it's a recurrent interest, and I think the really important thing about this is that there's often a strong sense that the dream world is more intense, more desirable, and possibly by virtue of that more real than the practical world. So although in a way there is always a recognition and people have to come back to the practical world, there's a kind of refusal to think that dreams are not in some sense real, that intensity, desire, magic are also real, and they're real by virtue of intensity. Okay, so what I've been trying to suggest is that not all of Minnelli is set pieces, it's not all climaxes, but there are set pieces in all the films. They're wonderful, and they have a magic and intensity that in a way affirms a kind of reality or a desire for that to be real against the kind of drabness of everyday life. Thank you.